Dr. Oscar Theo Alexander was proud of his 3D printed muscle technology. This morning he had smiled as he watched his helper bot, Robotnium, used the 3D printed metal and plastic muscles to move in a graceful and natural manner around his lab. No more. Poor Robotnium lay in twisted and torn pieces on the floor, and Dr. Alexander was locked in the aerodynamic wind testing tunnel adjacent to his primary lab space. He was breathing hard after his narrow escape. He relaxed his white-knuckle grip on the test lab door handle and peeked through the tiny wire mesh glass window. They were still there, tendrils of fury and twisting strings of evil. They were destroying his lab one bench and experiment at a time. Luckily no students were present at this late hour, and the only casualty was Robotnium, who lay under a seething mass of phone charging cables, power cords, Ethernet cables and USB cables. Calming himself with a breathing pattern from his kendo classes at the university, Dr. Alexander formed a plan. A rash, dangerous plan, which he put into action immediately. Smashing open the supply cage lock, he pushed a giant dewar of liquid nitrogen on its wheels into the wind tunnel space where the venting system controls were situated. The bangings and broken glass next door were getting louder. Quickly he worked to connect the tank to the venting system. Then he wrote some very quick lines of code, pressed enter to start his program, and ran to the tunnel emergency shelter, a tiny box to hide in if you were stuck in the wind tunnel and it happened to turn on. As he closed the box lid on himself, he heard breaking glass and saw a cable whip into the room. Just in time, the wind tunnel kicked on and dispersed a very cold payload into the vent system, which had been rerouted to send the freezing cold liquid nitrogen gas into the lab overrun with sentient cables. A few harrowing minutes later, it was all over. The tunnel timer went off and it stopped itself. The liquid nitrogen tank was empty. Dr. Alexander carefully left the box to survey the damage. The cables were frozen solid and most probably dead. He probed a few with a multimeter to be sure. Dead, but his lab was destroyed. Tables overturned, beakers splintered into pieces, the fridge door was off its hinges, and there were holes in the walls and broken external windows. If the chair of his department found out, he would have his research funding removed, or worse, maybe even be sacked. There would have to be a sacrifice. He looked at Robotnium. Yes, he would have to do. He would lie and say a virus had made Robotnium go crazy. Only his quick thinking with the liquid nitrogen had been enough to stop the mad robot. And the evidence, the 3D printed cables could be destroyed in the matter disintegration chute. He set to work. Hours later, with most of the evidence destroyed and the sun coming up outside on the school grounds, Dr. Alexander fell into a chair exhausted. He had done it. He was free to continue his research with the minor inconvenience of needing to replace his robot. And damn his colleague McTague for suggesting smart cables that could plug themselves in. It was all that fool's fault. His better instincts had been against the combination of his 3D printed robot muscle technology with swarms of intelligent nanobots. McTague must have it out for him. He would deal with McTague later. Dr. Alexander thought with revenge in his mind's eye. He flipped open Twitter to check the news as was his custom in the morning and was shocked to see the words, "Cable attacks" was trending. With trepidation and mounting horror, he clicked to watch a video. He recognized the place. It was a noodle shop in the city just off campus a few blocks from where he was currently seated. The audio was bad, but the shouting worker said something about robot snacks and, "Run, run." But then the video froze on an image that drained the color from Dr. Alexander's face. The paused video clearly showed some of his 3D printed cables had burst through the shop window and were destroying the soup counter. But how? He looked around his lab and his eyes fell on the broken windows that led outside and to the university grounds. Back and forth his eyes went from the noodle shop video to the broken window. Dr. Alexander put his head in his hands in despair. No more research for him. He could hear the heavy footsteps of people approaching his lab from down the hall.